A messenger once rode for months across a single empire, yet it never fractured. The true secret to holding vast realms together was not just armies, but administrative innovation. This is the hidden machinery of history, the ingenious systems of law, communication, and control that built our world. By the end, you will see the ancient blueprints for power that still shape nations and corporations today. How did a ruler in Rome enforce laws in Britain, or a Khan in Mongolia receive news from Hungary in weeks? We will uncover the frameworks that turned conquest into enduring order and ask what they reveal about our own complex age. What does it truly take to hold something vast together? That lone administrator, far from the capital, more subtle than any sword. Their tools were a stylus to etch orders onto clay or parchment, and a scroll containing the empire's law. This is the essence of administrative innovation, the hidden architecture that allows a single authority to govern lands it cannot personally see. It is the creation of novel systems, laws, and standardized practices designed to manage territory, resources, and millions of diverse people across impossible distances. The historian Niall Ferguson observed that the sinews of power are not military but financial and administrative. Armies conquer, but it is bureaucracy that holds. This involves crafting universal legal codes so a judge in a frontier town applies the same justice as one in the heartland. It means building a clear hierarchy of governance, a chain of command that stretches from the emperor's court down to the local tax collector. And critically, it requires designing networks for moving resources, information, and authority that function reliably without the ruler's constant, direct oversight. Consider the Persian Empire's royal road. It was far more than a simple path for travel. It was an administrative artery. Official couriers, fresh horses at relay stations, and secure waypoints allowed decrees from the king to flow to the provinces and vital intelligence to flow back. This system transformed the sprawling, chaotic aftermath of conquest into something sustainable, a realm of predictable order. It proves that the true glue of empire is not fear but functionality. How does this ancient idea of governance at a distance challenge our modern assumptions about control? We often think of power as immediate and visible. Yet these innovators mastered the art of influence through systems, creating frameworks so robust that the empire could almost run itself. This foundational understanding leads us directly to the first great architect of such a system, a ruler whose administrative blueprint would echo for millennia. The king in Persepolis could trust the report from Egypt because of a brilliant administrative invention. The Achaemenid Persians, under rulers like Darius I, mastered a continent not merely by marching armies, but by designing a system of governance that balanced power with pragmatism. They created the satrapy. This was the first major innovation in holding vast empires together, a model of delegation and oversight that would become a template for centuries. The empire was divided into around 20 provinces, each called a satrapy. A governor, the satrap, was appointed directly by the king. This was not a local warlord, but often a trusted Persian noble or a member of the royal family. His duties were clear: collect taxes, maintain internal order, raise local troops for defense, and administer justice according to the king's law. This structure granted significant local autonomy. A satrap in Egypt could manage the Nile's agricultural cycles, while one in Anatolia dealt with mountain tribes, each using their regional knowledge. But autonomy was not independence. The Persian genius lay in the counterbalance. To prevent any satrap from growing too powerful or corrupt, the king employed a separate network of royal agents, famously known as the eyes and ears of the king. These inspectors traveled the empire unannounced, reporting directly to the central court on the satrap's conduct. the province's loyalty, and the state of the treasury. It was a system of built-in accountability. The local governor had power, but he was constantly aware that unseen eyes were watching. This framework allowed for another profound stability: cultural tolerance. The Persian Empire was a mosaic of languages, gods, and traditions. Rather than imposing a single culture, the satrapy system required only a unified fiscal and legal framework. People could worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and follow many of their own customs, as long as they paid their taxes and kept the peace. The respect shown to Jewish exiles in Babylon, allowing them to rebuild their temple, is a powerful example. The empire functioned as a federation of diverse peoples under a single administrative umbrella. What made this balance so effective? It distributed the immense workload of governance while maintaining a thread of central control. It trusted local expertise but verified loyalty. This Persian model proved that empire could be more than just domination. It could be a sustainable, operational system. And this very blueprint would be studied, adapted, and perfected by the next great power to arise in the Mediterranean world. A Roman soldier stationed on the cold frontier of Britannia could marry, make a will, and conduct business under the same legal principles as a senator in Rome. This was the second great administrative innovation, the power of legal integration. Where the Persians balanced local rule with central oversight, the Romans wove their empire together with the threads of law and citizenship. They understood that shared rights could forge a loyalty deeper than any imposed by the sword. The foundation was a universal legal code. It began with the 12 tables, carved in bronze for all citizens to see, establishing that justice was not arbitrary but written. Centuries later, the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, compiled under Emperor Justinian, systematized centuries of legal thought into a single, coherent framework. This code provided answers for everything from property disputes and trade contracts to family inheritance. For a merchant in Gaul shipping wine to Alexandria, this predictability was priceless. He knew the rules of commerce were the same in both provinces, enforced by Roman magistrates. This created a stable, predictable environment where economic life could flourish across continents. But the Romans took a revolutionary step further. They extended the legal identity itself. Citizenship was initially a prized right of those born in Rome. Yet over time, it was granted to soldiers for service, to whole communities for loyalty, and eventually, in a stunning administrative move, to nearly every free person in the empire through the Edict of Caracalla in the year 212. Imagine the shift. A farmer in Syria or a craftsman in Spain was no longer merely a conquered subject. He was now a Roman citizen with legal standing, the right to a fair trial, and the responsibility to pay taxes into the system he was now part of. This transformed subjects into stakeholders. A person protects what they have a stake in. The empire was no longer just something that ruled over them. It was a structure they belonged to, with rights they could invoke. How does a shared legal identity forge a stronger bond than military force alone? Force demands obedience out of fear, but a shared system of justice invites participation out of mutual interest. It creates a common language of order that makes daily life, from the marketplace to the family home, function smoothly. The legacy of Roman law became the bedrock of legal systems across Europe and beyond, proving that the most enduring empires are built not just on territory, but on ideas of justice and belonging. Yet even the most brilliant legal framework is useless if commands cannot travel faster than gossip. A law written in Rome meant nothing in Britain if it arrived a year later. This reveals the next critical innovation, the empire's nervous system. A message from the Great Khan could cross continents faster than a rumor could cross a village. This was the third revolutionary innovation, the Mongol Yam, a communication network of breathtaking speed and scale that bound a decentralized empire with threads of information. In an age before the telegraph or even reliable roads, the Mongols engineered a system that moved intelligence at a pace Europe would not match for centuries. At its heart was a chain of relay stations called yams, spaced a day's ride apart along major routes from the capital at Karakoram to the distant frontiers in Persia, Russia, and China. Each station was stocked with fresh horses, fodder, food, and dedicated attendants. A courier bearing a tablet of authority, a paiser, would arrive at a station exhausted, hand his sealed message to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and that new rider would gallop to the next station. The message moved, not the man. This relentless relay could cover over 200 miles in a single day. A report from the Hungarian front could reach the Khan's council in a matter of weeks, not months. This transformed governance. A local commander could not rebel without the central authority learning of it almost in real time, and orders for reinforcement or diplomacy could be dispatched with stunning efficiency. The yam was more than a postal service. It was the central nervous system of a nomadic empire, allowing a mobile court to administer a static territory. But its genius extended beyond control. The same secured routes that carried military orders also carried merchants, diplomats, and scholars. The yam stations provided safety and supplies, effectively state-sponsored infrastructure for the Silk Road. Trade flourished as never before, with goods, ideas, and technologies flowing securely from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. This shows a profound administrative insight that a system built for control could also be the engine for prosperity and cultural exchange. How does rapid communication centralize power in a decentralized empire? It shrinks distance, making the ruler's presence felt everywhere at once. It prevents information bottlenecks and local power vacuums. The yam allowed the Mongols to rule not through a heavy, permanent bureaucracy in every town, but through the threat of immediate response from the center. It was governance through the guarantee of connection, yet with messages and merchants flowing so freely, a new challenge emerged. How do you manage the sheer volume of wealth, the taxes, the tribute, and the trade that now pulsed along these very routes? The empire's economic lifeblood needed its own kind of system. The wealth flowing along the Silk Road demanded more than just couriers. It required administrators who could count it, manage it, and govern the people who produced it. For this, one empire developed perhaps history's most enduring tool for selecting leadership. A young man from a remote village, his family possessing no noble title or great wealth, could through sheer intellectual effort earn a position governing thousands. This was the power of the Chinese Imperial examination system, the fourth revolutionary innovation that created a meritocratic bureaucracy to hold a civilization together for over 1,000 years. Perfected during the Tang and Song dynasties, this system was a radical departure from the norm. In a world where power was almost always inherited, China decided to select its government officials through a series of grueling, standardized tests. The curriculum was based on the Confucian classics, philosophy, history, and literary composition. Success demanded not just memorization, but a deep understanding of statecraft, ethics, and the principles of harmonious rule. Passing the highest-level exams held in the imperial capital could propel a scholar from obscurity to a prestigious post as a provincial governor or a minister in the central government. This process created a centralized administrative class, the scholar officials, whose loyalty was directed first to the emperor and the ideals of the state they had studied, not to a regional family dynasty. How did this stabilize an empire? It systematically prevented the rise of a hereditary aristocracy with its own power base. Ambitious and talented individuals from all across society saw their path to influence and prestige not in challenging the throne, but in mastering its examinations and joining its bureaucracy. Their fortunes became inextricably tied to the health of the imperial system itself. Furthermore, it ensured a remarkable consistency in policy implementation. A magistrate in the south and a governor in the north had been trained in the same texts and principles. They spoke the same administrative language, followed similar procedures for tax collection, justice, and public works, creating a predictable uniformity of governance across staggering distances. The system was not perfectly fair, of course, as years of study required resources many families did not have, yet it remained astonishingly open by historical standards. It created a revolving door where educated elites cycled through positions, bringing central ideology to the provinces and local knowledge back to the capital. This raises a timeless question about the nature of power. Can a system built on tested knowledge and merit produce more stable, effective governance than one based solely on birthright? For over a millennium, China's answer was a resounding yes. This intellectual framework supported a vast imperial structure, but another system focused on the most fundamental movement of all, the journey of its own citizens across an empty continent. A chasqui runner sprinted across a swaying rope bridge high in the Andes, a bundle of knotted cords in his hand. His message was not written on parchment, but encoded in the very knots he carried. This was the fifth great innovation, a masterful fusion of physical and data infrastructure that held the Inca Empire together without a single written word. Their system was built on two pillars, a monumental road network and a unique data storage device called the Quipu. The roads were an engineering marvel, over 25,000 miles of paved trails, stairways, and tunnels carved through some of the planet's most punishing terrain, from coastal deserts to cloud forests to peaks over 3 miles high. These were not public thoroughfares but state highways designed for administration. They enabled the rapid movement of imperial armies to quell unrest and the efficient transport of tribute goods like maize, textiles, and precious metals to state warehouses. Most importantly, they powered a relay system of runners, the chasquis, who could pass a message from Quito to Cuzco, a distance of over 1,000 miles, in less than a week. But what message were they carrying? That is where the second pillar, the Quipu, comes in. The Quipu was a collection of colored cords, often made from cotton or llama wool, with a series of intricate knots tied at precise positions. To an outsider, it looked like an abstract textile. To a trained Inca administrator, a Quipu Kamayak, it was a detailed record. The colors of the cords, their placement, the type of knot, and its position along the string all held specific meaning. A Quipu could record census data, tracking the population of a distant valley. It could log tax obligations, detailing how much grain a community owed to the state. It could serve as an inventory for a warehouse or a chronicle of historical events. This was a three-dimensional, tactile database, perfectly portable and durable. How does an administration function effectively without a formal writing system? The Inca answer was to build a system where the infrastructure itself became the medium of control. The roads moved physical things and people, while the quipus moved information. Together, they allowed the central government in Cuzco to manage a command economy of astonishing complexity. Officials could assess the resources of the entire empire, then redistribute goods from areas of surplus to those in need, mitigating famine. They could mobilize the mita, a labor tax, directing thousands of workers to build terraces, storehouses, or the very roads they traveled on. The state knew what it had, where it was, and who owed what. It was governance through meticulous accounting and logistical mastery, all achieved without alphabets or ledgers. This highlights a profound theme of adaptability, creating tools perfectly suited to the environment and needs of the empire. But what happens when an empire is not defined by contiguous land, but by vast, open ocean? The next great administrative mind would face a puzzle of a different scale, governing a realm where the territories were not connected by roads, but separated by the sea itself. A young graduate from Oxford could find himself drafting irrigation plans for the Nile Delta, then years later, administering justice in a remote Malaysian province. This was the sixth innovation, the British colonial civil service, a system of standardized administration stretched across oceans, binding a scattered empire not by land but by procedure. In the wake of the Northcote Trevelyan reforms of the 1850s, the British moved away from patronage and towards a professional, merit-based civil service. This model was exported overseas, creating a cadre of career officials, often educated at the same schools and universities, who were deployed across the globe. They brought with them a uniform toolkit, English common law, centralized accounting practices, and meticulous reporting systems that required every district officer from the Caribbean to Hong Kong to fill out forms in triplicate and send them back to London. This imposed a remarkable, if sometimes stifling, consistency. A legal principle established in a London court could be cited in a courtroom in Calcutta or Nairobi. Budgets were drafted and audited according to the same treasury rules, creating a predictable, if extractive, financial environment for trade. The stability this bureaucratic web provided, however controversial its origins, cannot be ignored. It built the infrastructure of a connected world, the Indian railways, the Suez Canal, the global telegraph network, all projects requiring long-term planning, standardized engineering, and vast capital that flowed more easily under a single administrative umbrella. This prompts a difficult but essential reflection. Can a system designed for control and extraction inadvertently create platforms for future connection and development? The administrative consistency, however imposed, laid down tracks, both literal and metaphorical, that shaped the modern global order. It provided a common language of law and commerce that, for better or worse, allowed different parts of the world to interact within a shared, if unequal, framework. Yet this entire global apparatus, from the district officer's salary to the steel for the railways, demanded a constant, colossal flow of capital. The bureaucratic machine was expensive, and it required a financial engine of unprecedented sophistication to keep it running. That engine would be forged not in an imperial capital, but in the counting houses and merchant banks of a rising commercial power. A decree drafted in a Madrid palace could dictate the layout of a city founded in the mountains of Peru. This seventh innovation, the Spanish Viceroyalty and the Council of the Indies, represents history's most ambitious attempt at centralized, long-distance colonial administration. Faced with the unimaginable scale and novelty of their American territories, the Spanish Habsburgs engineered a system designed to project royal authority across an ocean, treating the entire empire as a single, integrated unit of governance and economy. At the heart of this system was the Council of the Indies, a powerful committee based in Madrid. It functioned as the supreme brain of the empire, reviewing every major report, drafting all colonial legislation, and appointing key officials. Its most famous output was the Monumental Laws of the Indies, a sprawling legal code that attempted to regulate everything from city planning and mining operations to, in theory, the treatment of indigenous populations. These laws mandated that new towns be built on a grid pattern with a central plaza, a church, and a town hall, a template you can still see from Mexico to Argentina. This was administration as grand design, an effort to impose order and Spanish identity onto a continent from a desk thousands of miles away. To execute this vision on the ground, the empire was divided into viceroyalties like New Spain or Peru. These were not mere provinces but semi-autonomous kingdoms, each ruled by a viceroy who was the direct representative of the monarch himself. The viceroy possessed immense local authority, commanding armies, administering justice, and overseeing the vast economic machinery, especially the flow of silver from mines like Potosi. Yet his power was meticulously checked. He served a limited term, his finances were audited in a formal review at the end of his service, and he was constantly obliged to correspond with and seek approval from the distant council. This created a relentless tension. How does a council meeting in Spain effectively govern the daily realities of a silver mine in the Andes or a frontier mission in California? The system struggled with this delay and disconnect. A local crisis required an immediate decision, but the request for guidance took months to reach Madrid and months more for a reply to return. This inevitable lag often forced viceroys and local officials to adapt, interpret, or even quietly ignore central directives to address pressing needs, a practice known as obedezco pero no cumplo, I obey but I do not comply. The system's centralized design also aimed to control the empire's colossal wealth. All trade was funneled through specific ports and regulated by the famous fleet system, the flota, to protect treasure ships from pirates and ensure taxes were collected. The council attempted to manage the empire's most sensitive resource, its people, through laws intended to protect indigenous communities from the worst abuses of the encomienda system, though enforcement was wildly inconsistent. This grand administrative experiment reveals a profound challenge of scale. It was an early form of transnational corporate governance, a forerunner to how a modern global corporation might try to manage subsidiaries across the world with a uniform policy handbook. The Spanish system demonstrated both the power of a unified vision and the inevitable friction that arises when a rigid blueprint meets a complex, living world. It grappled with a puzzle every vast entity faces: how to balance the need for central control with the necessity of local adaptation. This tension between a unifying system and diverse local realities finds a powerful counterpoint in another empire, one that chose a different path entirely, mastering not rigid control but brilliant cultural synthesis. A Greek Orthodox patriarch in Istanbul could settle a marriage dispute or collect a community tax, all under the watchful but distant eye of the Sultan. This was the eighth innovation, the Ottoman Millet system, a masterclass in governing profound diversity through delegated authority. Faced with a sprawling empire composed of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, the Ottomans devised a solution that avoided the costly and explosive path of forced assimilation. Instead, they organized society by religious community, each group known as a millet. The largest were the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, and Jewish millets. Each was granted a remarkable degree of self-rule. Their own religious leaders, like the patriarch or the chief rabbi, acted as intermediaries between the community and the imperial state. These leaders administered personal law, everything from marriage and divorce to inheritance and religious education, according to the traditions of their own faith. They were responsible for collecting taxes from their community as a single block and delivering them to the imperial treasury. In return, the Sultan guaranteed their protection and the right to practice their religion. This was a pragmatic bargain. For the empire, it was efficient. It outsourced the granular, day-to-day governance of diverse populations to trusted community leaders who understood their people's customs and language. It minimized direct friction between the state and minority groups, reducing the need for constant military intervention. For the communities, it offered a vital space for cultural and religious survival within a Muslim-majority empire. A Jewish merchant in Salonika or an Armenian artisan in Anatolia could live their life, raise their family, and settle their disputes within the framework of their own identity. This system turned religious diversity from a potential source of rebellion into a recognized pillar of the imperial structure. What are the advantages of governing through such delegated communal authority? It creates stability through incorporation, not erasure. It allows a central power to manage complexity by compartmentalizing it, granting autonomy in matters of personal life while retaining ultimate control over security, foreign policy, and the major arteries of commerce. The Millet system acknowledged that people's deepest loyalties are often to their faith and community, and it cleverly wove those loyalties into the fabric of the state itself. But this layered sovereignty had its limits. It could reinforce separation, creating parallel societies that interacted less with each other over time. It also placed immense power in the hands of the Millet leaders, whose governance was not always equitable for all members of their own community. Yet for centuries, it provided a formula for relative peace in one of history's most religiously mixed regions. This sophisticated structure of delegated rule, however, required a steady and substantial flow of revenue to function. The Sultan's court, his armies, and his vast administrative machinery all demanded funding. This necessity leads us to the next critical innovation, the financial engine that powered not just an empire, but arguably the birth of the modern corporate world itself. A high-ranking Mansabdar might command 5,000 cavalry for the emperor, yet draw his salary from the harvest of a distant village he had never seen. This ninth innovation, the Mughal Mansabdari and Zabt systems, perfected the art of binding elite loyalty directly to the imperial center through a precise calculus of rank and revenue. Under the visionary rule of Akbar, these two interlocking frameworks created a centralized state of remarkable efficiency. The Mansabdari system was a military and administrative grading hierarchy. Every officer of the empire, from provincial governors to military commanders, was assigned a mansab, a rank denoted by a number. This number, like 5,000 or 1,000, dictated two critical things: the number of cavalry troops and horses the officer was required to maintain for imperial service, and the level of his personal salary. This was not a hereditary feudal title, but a personal appointment from the emperor, subject to review, promotion, or revocation. A Mansabdar's power and prestige flowed directly from the throne and could just as easily be taken away. This system ingeniously prevented the rise of entrenched, independent warlords. How does fusing military and civil service prevent the fragmentation of power? It makes the entire elite class dependent on the emperor for their status, wealth, and purpose. Their armies were the emperor's armies, mobilized for his campaigns, not for private rebellion. Their income, however, came not from the imperial treasury in coin, but from the land itself, through the companion Zabt system. The Zabt was a sophisticated, almost scientific, framework for land revenue. Imperial agents conducted detailed surveys of agricultural land across the empire, assessing soil quality, crop types, and average yields over a 10-year period. Based on this data, a standardized cash tax was calculated for each region. The right to collect this revenue from a specific area, called a jagir, was then assigned to a Mansabdar as his salary. He did not own the land or govern its people. He merely collected the tax due, using it to fund his military contingent and his household. The actual local administration remained in the hands of imperial bureaucrats and the traditional village headmen. This created a predictable, monetized revenue stream directly tied to the empire's agricultural base, its true source of wealth. The brilliance lay in the separation. The military elite received their income from the land, but they had no permanent, hereditary claim to that territory. They were rotated to different jagirs every few years, preventing them from building a local power base. Their loyalty remained exclusively to the emperor, who assigned their rank and their revenue rights. This structure transformed the state into a vast, centrally managed corporation, where every senior executive's compensation was stock in the empire's overall productivity. The symbolic power that legitimized this entire machine was just as crucial. Akbar's court rituals, his patronage of art and architecture, and his policy of inclusive dialogue, sul-i-kul, cultivated an imperial ideology that made service to the Mughal throne the highest aspiration for a noble. The rank was not just a paycheck, it was an honor. This fusion of material incentive and cultural prestige created a stable, centralized order that could project power across the Indian subcontinent for generations. Yet, for all its sophistication, this system still required a constant, accurate flow of information about harvests, weather, and local conditions to function. The empire's brain needed data, and that data had to move. A coin bearing the emperor's face could travel further and speak more directly than any imperial decree. This 10th innovation, the strategic use of symbolic power and monumental architecture, reveals how empires made their abstract authority a tangible, daily reality for millions. Beyond laws and roads, they mastered the art of visual persuasion, embedding the idea of the state into the very landscape and the objects people held in their hands. Standardized coinage was a masterstroke of this symbolic governance. When a merchant in Roman Britain used a silver denarius stamped with the profile of Augustus, he was not just conducting trade. He was holding a portable piece of propaganda, a miniature monument that affirmed who ruled, guaranteed the coin's value, and connected his local market to a vast economic network. The emperor's face became synonymous with stability and trust, a psychological anchor in a world of diverse languages and customs. Similarly, monumental architecture served a dual purpose, practical and profound. The Roman aqueduct was not merely a water delivery system, it was a breathtaking declaration of imperial capability. Its soaring arches crossing a valley demonstrated an engineering prowess that local tribes could not match, while the clean, reliable water it brought to a city was a daily, benevolent reminder of the peace and prosperity the empire provided. It made the state useful and awesome simultaneously. In the Andes, the Incas' endless agricultural terraces sculpted into mountainsides were more than just farms. They were a visible transformation of the wild landscape into ordered, productive state property, a symbol of the empire's power to reshape the world and feed its people. These projects created a shared symbolic language, a citizen in Tenochtitlan witnessing a ritual at the towering Templo Mayor, or a traveler seeing the Great Wall snaking across China's northern frontier, received the same unspoken message: the power that built this is eternal, and you are part of its story. The architecture was a permanent, physical claim on the land and the imagination. Can infrastructure and symbolism be as important as laws for maintaining unity? Absolutely, laws dictate behavior, but symbols shape identity and perception. They answer the silent question every subject might ask: why should I accept this distant authority? The aqueduct answers with water, the coin answers with reliable commerce, the temple answers with spiritual order. They make the empire's benefits visible and its power felt, fostering a sense of belonging to something grand and permanent. This symbolic layer softened the hard edges of administrative control, weaving the idea of the state into the fabric of daily life. Yet for all their grandeur, these symbols of unity were projected onto a world of incredible local diversity. The final and perhaps most delicate innovation would be the system designed not to override this diversity, but to manage it, to weave a tapestry of countless local threads into a single imperial design without tearing them apart. A merchant in Alexandria could trust the weight of a silver coin from Rome. This 11th innovation, the standardization of weights, measures, and coinage, built an invisible framework for trust that held empires together economically. It was the silent language of the marketplace, understood from one frontier to another, and it did more to unify daily life than any single law. The creation of a universal currency was a revolution in simplicity. Before standardization, trade was a tangled web of local barter systems, unfamiliar coinages, and variable measures, each transaction bogged down by haggling over value and authenticity. An empire that minted its own coin, like the Athenian owl tetradrachm or the Roman denarius, cut through that noise. Suddenly, a trader in Gaul knew the silver content of the coin in his hand was guaranteed by a distant authority. He could do business in Lyon or Carthage without needing a money changer at every port. This drastically reduced what economists call transaction costs, the hidden friction of doing business across distances. It made commerce faster, safer, and far more profitable, weaving regions together through mutual economic interest. But standardized coinage was also a powerful tool of statecraft. It allowed the central government to control the money supply, stabilizing economies and funding its ambitions. And every coin was a tiny billboard, the profile of the emperor, a symbol of the state, or a motto of peace traveled in every purse, a constant, subtle reminder of whose authority guaranteed that value. This was iconography in the palm of your hand, the same principle applied to weights and measures, an imperial decree establishing a standard unit for grain, like the Roman modius, or a standard length for cloth, transformed taxation and administration. A tax collector in a distant province could no longer use a falsely large basket to demand extra grain from farmers. The measure was set, known to all, and enforceable by imperial agents. This made revenue collection predictable, efficient, and far less vulnerable to the petty corruption that could breed resentment. It created a baseline of fairness, or at least predictable expectation, that made the state's financial demands seem more legitimate. How does this economic standardization quietly build an imperial common market? It creates a platform for seamless exchange. When everyone uses the same rules, resources flow to where they are most valued. A farmer in Egypt could grow surplus wheat for a known price, sell it to a merchant with a trusted scale, who could ship it to feed the city of Rome, with all accounts settled in a currency accepted by everyone along the route. The empire ceased to be a collection of separate economies and began to function as a single, integrated organism. This economic predictability was a force for unity as powerful as any legion. It gave millions of people, from merchants to peasants, a practical, daily stake in the stability of the system that made their livelihoods possible. With commerce flowing smoothly and the treasury filling predictably, the state possessed immense resources, but to wield them effectively, it needed precise knowledge. It needed to answer fundamental questions: how many subjects are there to tax, how much land is there to cultivate, and where are the resources to build the next great project? This demand for knowledge leads to the next, and perhaps most intimate, administrative innovation of all. The name of every head of household, their age, and the size of their landholding were carefully inscribed on bamboo strips. This 12th innovation, the systematic census and population register, transformed the abstract mass of humanity into a quantifiable, manageable resource. From the Han Dynasty's detailed household records to the Roman Empire's periodic censuses for taxation and military service, this practice provided the fundamental data upon which every other administrative function relied. It was the empire's diagnostic tool, a way to take the pulse of its entire domain. The famous Domesday Book commissioned by William the Conqueror was not merely a property survey. It was a breathtakingly ambitious act of administrative intelligence, cataloguing who owned what across England to determine tax liabilities with ruthless efficiency. This data served multiple critical purposes. Most obviously, it enabled accurate taxation. By knowing the number of households, the acres under cultivation, and the heads of livestock, the state could calculate what it was owed without relying solely on the word of local elites. It also allowed for the fair, or at least systematic, allocation of corvée labor, the mandatory work on public projects like roads, walls, and canals that built imperial infrastructure. Furthermore, it was essential for military planning, identifying how many able-bodied men were available for conscription from each region, but the impact went deeper than logistics. The very act of being counted, of having one's existence officially recorded by a distant authority, was a powerful psychological transaction. It acknowledged the individual or the household as a recognized component of the state. You were no longer just a person living on the land. You were a registered taxpayer, a potential laborer, a subject with a defined place in the imperial ledger. This transformed people from an unknown quantity into a known and therefore manageable entity. How does comprehensive data collection become the bedrock of governance? It replaces guesswork with knowledge and suspicion with predictability. A regional governor could no longer hide the true wealth of his province to skim profits, and the central treasury could budget for the coming year based on reliable projections. These registers also allowed empires to detect long-term trends, like population growth in one area or decline in another, enabling proactive responses like incentivizing migration or adjusting grain storage. The census made the state omniscient, at least on paper, giving it the eyes to see its own body. Yet this intimate knowledge of people and production would be useless if the fruits of that labor, the grain, the cloth, the metals, could not be moved to where they were needed most. This precise understanding of capacity directly empowered the next, and perhaps most vital, system of all, the logistical networks that fed cities and armies. A full granary is a promise of tomorrow. The 13th innovation, the state-controlled granary and redistributive economy, transformed the threat of famine into a tool of imperial stability. Across continents, empires mastered the art of storing surplus to become the ultimate provider, weaving the basic need for food into the fabric of central authority. The Chinese Song dynasty perfected this with its ever-normal granaries, a network of state storehouses designed to buy grain after abundant harvests when prices were low, and release it during lean years to prevent price spikes and hunger. This was a conscious effort to smooth out the volatile cycles of an agricultural economy, demonstrating the state's role not just as a tax collector, but as a guardian of public welfare. In Rome, the annona system was a colossal logistical operation, a guaranteed grain dole for the city's plebeians. Ships laden with wheat from Egypt and North Africa sailed into Ostia, their cargo distributed to citizens, ensuring that the restless population of the capital was fed and therefore pacified. The message was clear: the emperor's bounty sustained the very life of the city. In the Andes, the Inca took this concept to its zenith. Thousands of state storehouses, called colcas, dotted the mountainsides, stocked with freeze-dried potatoes, maize, textiles, and tools. These were not emergency reserves alone, but a redistributive bank. The state collected these goods as a form of tax through the mitre labor system, and then redistributed them to support the army, the priesthood, the bureaucracy, and communities hit by local crop failure. An Inca soldier on campaign far from home would be supplied from a state colca. A community whose fields were damaged by frost could petition for aid from the imperial stores. This system answered the most fundamental human question: where will my next meal come from? By providing an answer, the state made itself indispensable. How does control over basic sustenance translate into political stability? It creates a bond of dependency that is far more reliable than fear. A hungry population rebels, but a population that looks to the state in times of scarcity sees it as a source of security. This was welfare as statecraft, a brilliant pre-modern social contract. The granary system showcased the empire's logistical prowess and its claim to benevolent power, proving that the most effective authority often rests not on the ability to punish, but on the capacity to provide. This mastery of distribution required not just warehouses, but the very channels to move these mountains of grain. The stone road beneath your feet was the empire's handshake with a distant province. This 14th innovation, state-sponsored infrastructure, turned abstract authority into a physical, daily reality. While laws and taxes defined the rules, it was the roads, aqueducts, and monumental buildings that made the empire feel permanent, useful, and awe-inspiring. These projects were the ultimate demonstration of administrative power, a declaration that the state could not only govern people, but reshape the very world they lived in. The Roman road network is the classic example. These were not mere paths but engineered highways layered with gravel, stone, and concrete, designed to drain water and withstand heavy carts. A legion could march from Rome to the Rhine in weeks instead of months, allowing rapid response to unrest. But the road's purpose was dual. That same paved surface carried merchants, their goods moving safely and quickly, tying regional economies into a single imperial market. The road was a line of control that became a line of commerce, a symbol of peace through connectivity. Similarly, irrigation systems like those in ancient Mesopotamia or China were feats of administrative coordination. Digging and maintaining vast canals required surveying thousands of acres, mobilizing and feeding thousands of laborers, and allocating water rights fairly among communities. The state that managed this did not just collect taxes, it directly increased the wealth it could tax by turning arid land into fertile fields. The harvest surplus from these projects fed cities, funded armies, and stored in those state granaries, creating a cycle of stability. And then there were the monuments, the Colosseum in Rome, the Great Wall in China, the grand temples in every imperial capital. These served a profound symbolic function. They displayed the empire's resources, technical skill, and ambition on a scale that no local chieftain could ever match. They inspired pride in citizens and awe in visitors, making the power of the state visible and unforgettable. Can bricks and mortar forge a stronger bond than laws alone? They can make the law's benefits tangible. A farmer drinking from a Roman aqueduct or crossing a sturdy bridge during the flood season experiences the empire as a provider of safety and prosperity, not just a demander of taxes. These structures created a shared landscape of experience, a common physical world that everyone, from senator to slave, interacted with daily. They were the ultimate branding, etching the idea of imperial order into stone and soil. But the true administrative marvel was not the structure itself, it was the hidden machinery that built it. Organizing these projects required a specialized class of managers, surveyors, and engineers. It demanded systems to requisition materials, to house and feed a massive workforce, often drawn from the labor tax or corvée systems we discussed earlier, and to maintain the finished work for generations. This long-term commitment to upkeep, the constant repair of a road or a canal, signaled that the empire was thinking in centuries, not just seasons. It was an investment in perpetual unity. The enduring legacy of these works, many still in use millennia later, answers a silent question about what holds a civilization together. It suggests that the most enduring power is often the kind that builds, that connects, and that leaves behind a foundation others can walk upon long after the empire itself has faded into history. The empire's memory was written in ink, not stone. While monuments proclaimed its glory, the true continuity of power flowed from the pens of a professional scribe and clerk class. This 15th innovation transformed administration from the personal whim of a ruler into the enduring science of state. In the hushed scriptoria of Constantinople, clerks meticulously copied imperial decrees onto parchment, creating multiple authenticated copies for distribution across the provinces. In the halls of the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, mandarins drafted memorials and logged census data with flawless brushwork. These were not merely secretaries, they were the human hard drives of the ancient and medieval world, the indispensable technicians of governance. Their specialized literacy was a form of power. In Egypt, the scribe's mastery of hieratic script gave him authority over land deeds, tax rolls, and temple inventories. In the Roman Empire, notaries certified contracts and wills, their seals making private agreements legally binding under imperial law. This created a self-perpetuating administrative culture. A young man entered as an apprentice, learning the precise formulas for drafting a tax assessment or a provincial governor's report. He mastered the archives, knowing where every land grant or legal precedent was stored. This knowledge made him and his peers indispensable. They were the institutional memory, the ones who knew how things had always been done, ensuring procedures continued smoothly even when a weak emperor sat on the throne or a dynasty fell and was replaced. The professionalization of this class turned chaos into routine. It meant that the harvest tax in a distant valley would be calculated the same way this year as it was 20 years prior, creating a predictable, if sometimes burdensome, relationship between the state and the people. Does the ultimate power of an empire reside in the hands of its record keepers? In a very real sense, yes. Their ledgers defined reality for the state. What was written down existed, what was not recorded was lost. They translated the messy, vibrant life of millions into neat columns of numbers and standardized reports, making the vast and ungovernable suddenly manageable. This meticulous record-keeping was the absolute prerequisite for the empire's most consistent demand, the uniform collection of revenue. Without the scribe's tally, the tax collector's demand was just an arbitrary shout in the marketplace. The scribe's ledger was a promise, and the tax collector's visit was its fulfillment. This 16th innovation, the uniform taxation system, transformed the empire's abstract need for resources into a predictable, rhythmic exchange that defined the very relationship between the state and the individual. Whether it was the Roman tributum, the Islamic kharaj on agricultural land, or the Aztec expectation of tribute from subject cities, these were not random acts of plunder. They were systematized, calculated, and often meticulously recorded, becoming the financial heartbeat that powered everything else: the armies, the roads, the scribes themselves. In the Abbasid Caliphate, the Central Diwan, or Financial Bureau, maintained detailed records that allowed agents to assess a farmer's land based on its crop and irrigation, demanding a share of the harvest that was consistent from one province to the next. This predictability was itself a form of stability. A peasant might resent the burden, but he could at least anticipate it and plan his year accordingly. The state, in turn, could budget for its vast projects, knowing with reasonable certainty what revenue would flow into its coffers. The genius often lay in adaptation. Instead of inventing a wholly new system, empires frequently formalized pre-existing local practices, grafting their own administrative oversight onto familiar traditions. This made the new authority feel less alien and more like an evolution of the old order. The Aztec flowery wars, for instance, were ritualized conflicts with neighboring states. While they served military training and religious purposes, they also systematically secured a flow of tribute goods: feathers, cacao, textiles, and captives, integrating surrounding peoples into a hierarchical economic network centered on Tenochtitlan. How does the method of taxation define the relationship between a state and its people? It establishes a fundamental contract. The regular extraction of wealth, especially when perceived as consistent and somewhat equitable, cements a hierarchical bond. It is an acknowledgement, however grudging, of the center's authority and the periphery's obligation. This flow of resources from the many to the few funded the very symbols and systems that encouraged cultural integration, building the monuments and patronizing the arts that projected a unified imperial identity. The tax was the fuel for the engine of unity, a necessary transaction that made every citizen, in a tangible sense, an investor in the empire's continued existence. The Latin words spoken in a forum in Gaul echoed the same grammar taught in the schools of Rome. This 17th innovation, state-sponsored education and language policy, targeted the mind itself, cultivating a shared worldview among the elite that would bind provinces to the center for generations. It was a patient, profound investment in ideological cohesion. The Roman model is iconic. Young men from provincial aristocratic families, from places like Hispania or North Africa, were often brought to Rome for advanced education in rhetoric, law, and philosophy. They immersed themselves in Latin literature and Roman civic ideals, Upon returning home, they did not just govern, they embodied Rome. They built villas in the Roman style, presided over courts using Roman law, and promoted Latin as the language of administration and high culture. They became the most effective agents of integration because their authority was locally rooted yet ideologically aligned with the imperial core. A similar process unfolded in Han Dynasty China with the imperial examination system, which was itself a massive educational project. The state effectively defined the curriculum, the Confucian classics, as the sole path to prestige and power. This meant that any ambitious family, anywhere in the empire, had a powerful incentive to school its sons in the same texts, promoting loyalty to the emperor, filial piety, and social harmony. The empire was unifying minds through a standardized library. The Incas employed a more direct method, taking the sons of conquered local chiefs to Cuzco to be educated in Quechua, Inca religion, and statecraft. These youths, once returned, would be fluent in the language and customs of their rulers, serving as reliable intermediaries. This practice created a trans-regional elite class that could communicate seamlessly with the central administration. Can a shared language be the most subtle and effective tool of imperial administration? Absolutely. It reduces the constant friction of translation and misunderstanding in governance. When a decree is issued or a tax assessed, a local official interpreting it through the prism of his own language might misunderstand or resist. But if that official thinks and administers in the empire's tongue, the central will flows with far less distortion. This cultural layer did not replace the legions or the tax collectors. It made their work infinitely easier by creating a collaborative class. It turned administration from a process of imposition into one of participation for the privileged. The goal was not to erase every local dialect or tradition, but to overlay them with a unifying layer of high culture and communication reserved for the business of state. This was empire building at the level of identity, offering the brightest from the provinces a stake in the system by inviting them into its most exclusive club, the circle of those who understood how it worked and who spoke its language. This cultural integration, however, was a project spanning decades. It required a stable environment where such slow work could take root, a condition made possible by the most fundamental guarantee an empire could offer. A retired legionary could become the most loyal citizen in a foreign land. The 18th innovation, the strategic use of colonies and settlements, transformed soldiers and settlers into permanent anchors of imperial culture and control. From the Greek apoikia establishing trade outposts across the Mediterranean to the Roman coloniae and later Spanish presidios, this was a deliberate act of demographic engineering. When Rome granted conquered land to its retired veterans, it was not merely a pension. It was a calculated administrative strategy. These men, deeply loyal to the state that rewarded them, built farms, raised families, and formed communities that were culturally and politically Roman in the heart of newly pacified territory. They became a self-policing bulwark. If local unrest stirred, these veteran colonies were the first line of defense, a ready militia already in place. They also served as nodal points for administration, places where Roman law was practiced daily and Roman customs were on visible display. How does changing the demographic landscape solidify political control? It makes the imperial presence irreversible and familiar. A local population might resist a distant king, but they must interact daily with Roman neighbors who speak Latin, use Roman coin, and build Roman-style villas. The colony demonstrates permanence. It says the empire is not just passing through, it is putting down roots, raising children, and planting crops for the next generation. This physical transplant of the core culture into the periphery created a powerful psychological effect, normalizing the new order through everyday life. The Spanish presidio forts in the Americas functioned similarly. acting as fortified hubs from which cultural and religious norms radiated into the surrounding region. These settlements were more than military garrisons. They were seeds from which towns grew, blending, often uneasily, with the existing landscape. Yet for these islands of imperial culture to thrive and function as part of a greater whole, they could not remain isolated. Their very survival depended on a constant, reliable connection to the heartland they represented. They needed a lifeline, a clear and secure pathway back home. A royal wedding could be the most important administrative act of the year. This 19th innovation, diplomatic marriages and elite integration, transformed the private lives of rulers into a public instrument of state, weaving alliances with threads of kinship. When a Byzantine princess, Theodora, married a Kievan Rus prince, Vladimir, in the 10th century, it was far more than a personal union. It was a strategic binding of two worlds. The Rus, formidable warriors from the north, were brought firmly into the Byzantine cultural and religious orbit, adopting Orthodox Christianity and absorbing artistic and administrative influences from Constantinople. This single marriage secured a volatile frontier more effectively than a dozen military campaigns, turning a potential rival into a dynastic ally and a cultural pupil. The Habsburgs of Europe later perfected this art, their motto famously becoming, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." Through calculated unions, they accumulated territories across the continent, building an empire with dowries and inheritance claims as much as with armies. But this practice was not confined to the courts of Europe. The Mongol Khans would marry daughters of conquered rulers, binding those families to the imperial project with personal ties of obligation and honor. The Inca would take the daughters of local ethnic lords, the Curakas, into the imperial household, both as a guarantee of their father's loyalty and to educate them in Inca ways before they might return to their home regions. This process of elite integration worked on a powerful human level. By offering local chieftains and nobles a place within the imperial aristocracy, a title, a pension, or a marriage alliance, the empire co-opted the very people most capable of organizing rebellion. It gave them a stake in the system's survival. Their prestige and power now derived from their connection to the emperor, not from opposition to him. Can dynastic politics be considered a formal administrative system? In these vast pre-modern states, absolutely. Where bureaucratic reach was limited, personal loyalty was paramount. A family bond created a network of obligation that paperwork could not. It blurred the line between conqueror and conquered at the very top, turning administration into, quite literally, a family affair. This web of kinship facilitated a quiet, continuous cultural exchange, as art, fashion, language, and religious ideas flowed along the same channels as royal correspondence and wedding gifts. Yet for all its effectiveness among the elite, this system of integration by marriage and title left the everyday beliefs of the broader population untouched. A local lord might pledge loyalty to a distant emperor, but the farmers in his fields, the artisans in his towns, still prayed to their own gods and followed their own seasonal rhythms. To truly unite the empire's soul required a different, more profound kind of integration, one that spoke not to political ambition but to spiritual longing. The emperor's blessing was a sacred command. The 20th innovation, state control of religion and ideology, turned faith itself into an administrative pillar, sanctifying the ruler's authority and making loyalty a spiritual virtue. This was not merely about personal belief, but about co-opting the most powerful narratives of a society to serve the state's unifying purpose. In Rome, the emperor held the title Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion. He presided over sacrifices and festivals that were as much political ceremonies as they were religious rites. Over time, especially in the provinces, the imperial cult emerged where the genius or divine spirit of the emperor was venerated. This created a universal ritual of allegiance that transcended local gods. A merchant in Ephesus offering incense before a statue of Augustus was performing an act of civic duty as much as piety, publicly affirming his place in the Roman order. In China, the concept of the mandate of heaven provided the philosophical bedrock for dynastic rule. The emperor was the son of heaven, the sole legitimate intermediary between the celestial realm and the human world. His performance of elaborate, exclusive rituals at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, praying for good harvests and cosmic harmony, demonstrated his unique role in maintaining the balance of all things. A poor harvest or a natural disaster could be interpreted as a sign the mandate was withdrawn, justifying rebellion. This ideology made the emperor's authority conditional on good governance, but it also made obedience to a just ruler a cosmic necessity. In Byzantium, Caesaropapism saw the emperor wield supreme authority over both the church and the state, appointing patriarchs and influencing doctrinal debates to ensure religious unity supported political unity. The Islamic Caliphate merged religious and political leadership from its inception, with the caliph serving as successor to the prophet Muhammad in guiding the community of believers. This fusion meant that challenging the ruler could be framed as challenging divine order itself. How does spiritual authority reinforce temporal power? It answers the deepest question of legitimacy: why should I obey? A tax collector demands your grain by law, but a priest-king asks for your loyalty as part of a sacred covenant. It transforms coercion into consent, framing administrative demands, taxation, military service, obedience to law, as duties required by a higher power. This provided a common ideological language that could resonate across diverse ethnic and linguistic groups, uniting them under a shared sense of purpose and destiny. It made the empire feel like more than a political entity. It was a divinely ordained community. Yet this very fusion of altar and throne created its own vulnerabilities. A challenge to religious orthodoxy could become a rebellion against the state, and a political rival could cloak his ambition in the language of theological reform. Even with this powerful spiritual glue, the empire's greatest threats often festered within, not beyond, its borders. A whisper in the market could reach the palace before the sun set. The 21st innovation, internal security and intelligence networks, addressed the empire's most persistent fear, the enemy within. To govern continents, rulers needed not just to see their lands on a map, but to hear their heartbeat, to sense discontent before it erupted into open defiance. This required building eyes and ears that operated in the shadows, transforming rumor into actionable intelligence. The mechanisms varied widely. The Roman Empire repurposed its military supply officers, the frumentarii, into a network of imperial couriers and secret agents. They could investigate corruption among provincial governors or track early signs of unrest, their dual role making their movements commonplace and their true purpose easily concealed. In Qin Dynasty China, the legalist philosophy of Shang Yong introduced a system of mutual responsibility among households, grouping families into units where all were held accountable for the actions of one. This turned every neighbor into a potential informant, leveraging social pressure as a tool for enforcing order and reporting dissent. The goal was preventative, to smother the spark of rebellion before it could catch flame. The very awareness that such networks might exist created a pervasive atmosphere of watchfulness. A governor considering disloyalty or a community plotting resistance could never be certain who might report them. This intangible pressure often proved as effective as any visible garrison in ensuring compliance. How does a state balance security with trust? These systems reveal a central tension in imperial administration. The same connectivity that allowed for efficient governance, the roads and postal routes, also became channels for surveillance. The bureaucracy that recorded harvests and populations could also flag anomalies, a sudden drop in a region's tax payments or unusual movement of people that signaled potential trouble. This was administration as a nervous system attuned to the slightest tremor. Yet this darker side of cohesion prompts a difficult reflection about the nature of power. Does the effective rule of vast, diverse territories inevitably require an apparatus of internal control? The historical record suggests that empires perceived as stable, from Rome to the Ottomans with their elaborate networks of informants, invested deeply in understanding and often managing the internal moods of their subjects. They sought to replace the chaos of unpredictable rebellion with the cold predictability of monitored order. Monitoring the present was essential, but so was securing the future. The stability of the entire edifice could not rest on surveillance alone. It ultimately depended on the single, most critical decision any empire faced: the peaceful transfer of power from one ruler to the next. The throne was the single most dangerous point of failure in the entire imperial system. A war of succession could unravel decades of administrative work in a matter of months, paralyzing tax collection, halting infrastructure projects, and encouraging distant governors to declare independence. The 22nd innovation, therefore, was not a tool or a network, but a process, the creation of mechanisms for peaceful succession and dynastic stability. This was the ultimate test of an administrative system's resilience. Without a clear, accepted way to transfer power, every other innovation, the roads, the laws, the granaries, became vulnerable to the chaos that followed a ruler's passing. Consider the Mughal Empire after the death of a great emperor. The court often erupted into brutal wars of succession where princes, each backed by rival factions of nobles and generals, fought for the throne. These conflicts consumed vast resources, shattered the centralized command structure, and left the empire's administrative machinery in disarray until a victor emerged. This chronic weakness forced other empires to devise more systematic, if sometimes ruthless, solutions. The Ottoman Empire, for a time, institutionalized a practice of royal fratricide. Upon a sultan's ascension, his brothers could be removed to prevent future civil war. This was a grim administrative calculation, prioritizing the stability of the state over the lives of a few to avoid the deaths of thousands in a protracted conflict. In contrast, the Chinese imperial system, influenced by Confucian principles, worked to formalize the principle of primogeniture, designating an heir apparent early and educating him rigorously in statecraft. The very existence of a crown prince created a focal point for bureaucratic loyalty, allowing the administration to align itself with the future ruler even before the transition occurred. How does the process of transferring power test the strength of an administrative system? It reveals whether loyalty is to the individual ruler or to the office and the state itself. A system built purely around a charismatic leader collapses when he is gone. But a system where bureaucrats, soldiers, and regional governors have a vested interest in the continuity of the structure itself can weather the storm of succession. The goal was to make the state immortal, even as its mortal rulers came and went. This was administration planning for its own perpetuity, designing a way for the machine to keep running while the driver changed. Yet for all the planning, for all the intricate systems of law, communication, and control, the most robust empires eventually faced pressures they could not administer away. The world beyond their borders was changing, and new forces were rising that would challenge the very logic of centralized imperial rule. A Mongol tax collector in Persia might consult records kept in Persian script by a local scribe. This 23rd innovation, the adaptation and incorporation of local systems, reveals a profound administrative pragmatism. The most resilient empires did not insist on reinventing every wheel. Instead, they often looked at the conquered territory, identified the existing machinery that worked, and grafted their own authority onto it. This was not a sign of weakness, but of confident strategic strength. When the Mongols swept into the sophisticated bureaucratic states of Persia or China, they faced a choice: They could try to impose their own nomadic tribal methods onto complex, urban, agricultural societies, a recipe for chaos and collapse. Or they could do what they did, hire the experts. They retained the Persian divan, the existing financial bureau, to manage taxation and records. In China, they employed Chinese scholars and administrators who knew the land, the people, and the intricate systems of the civil service. The Mongols provided the supreme military and political authority, while the local apparatus handled the day-to-day governance. This approach offered immense advantages. It drastically reduced resistance from the conquered populace because the immediate face of authority often remained familiar. It leveraged deep local expertise that an outside ruler could never hope to quickly replicate. A Chinese administrator knew how to manage the Yellow River's irrigation cycles. A Persian scribe knew the complex land tenure customs of the region. By using them, the empire could function efficiently from day one. The Romans practiced a similar flexibility with their client kingdoms. A local ruler in places like Judea or Armenia would swear allegiance to Rome, pay tribute, and provide troops. In return, they were left to govern their internal affairs largely according to their own traditions. This created a buffer zone of loyal allies, reducing the direct administrative and military burden on Rome itself. It was a form of strategic outsourcing. When is adopting local methods a sign of strength? It is when the central power is secure enough in its ultimate authority that it does not need to micromanage every cultural detail. It demonstrates a focus on results over rigid ideology. The goal was effective control and steady revenue, not cultural purity. This administrative hybridization created more flexible, responsive systems. An empire that could vary its approach between a directly ruled province and a client kingdom, or between a Mongol overseer and a Persian tax collector, could manage a far wider array of territories. It could absorb different peoples without constantly trying to smash them into a single, alien mold. This pragmatic absorption became a secret engine of longevity. It allowed empires to scale their rule without overextending their own administrative culture. They built a composite structure where local bricks were held together with the mortar of imperial supremacy. This flexibility would become the defining trait of the last great imperial systems, as they faced a new world of global trade, competing ideas, and unprecedented interconnection. The old models of isolation were breaking down, and the final innovation would be the one that tried to manage not just territory, but the entire globe as a single, interconnected system. A single ship flying the company flag could raise an army and mint its own coins. This 24th innovation, the role of trade policies and chartered companies, represents a pivotal shift in how empires projected power across oceans. In the Age of Sail, the British and Dutch East India Companies were not merely businesses, they were sovereign entities in all but name, granted royal charters that gave them exclusive trading rights, the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and govern territory in the name of their home countries. This was a radical administrative experiment, outsourcing the frontier work of empire to a corporate boardroom. The company built fortified trading posts like Madras or Batavia, which grew into full administrative centers. They established their own legal codes to manage European employees and local laborers on plantations, created complex logistics for moving tea, spices, and textiles, and developed diplomatic relations with regional rulers. These frameworks were not born from a ministry in London or Amsterdam, but from a profit-driven need for order and efficiency in distant lands. Their systems for accounting, supply chains, and labor management became the blueprints that later, formal colonial governments would inherit and expand. Can corporate structures effectively perform the functions of a state for a time, spectacularly so? They solved the classic imperial problem of distance and cost by making expansion a venture funded by private investors, with the state sharing in the profits while shouldering little of the initial risk. The company's entire purpose was to create stable, controllable environments for extraction, and in doing so, it inadvertently built the administrative skeleton of future colonies. Yet this blurring of commerce and sovereignty created a system with profound contradictions. The company's primary duty was to its shareholders, not to the well-being of the territories it governed. This could lead to decisions focused on short-term gain over long-term stability, with the human and environmental costs of intensive plantation agriculture or resource mining borne by the land and its people. These corporate networks wove the world together in a new, relentless way, creating a truly global system of production and trade. They were the forerunners of the modern multinational corporation, demonstrating that economic power could organize space and people as effectively as any imperial decree. This innovation marked the dawn of a connected planetary age, but it also set the stage for the final, and perhaps most complex, challenge these vast administrative systems would ever face: a world where the very idea of empire was becoming obsolete. The modern civil servant filing a report in New Delhi or Paris is part of a chain that stretches back centuries. This 25th innovation is perhaps the most profound, the direct inheritance of imperial administrative frameworks by the modern nation-state itself. The empires did not simply collapse and vanish, leaving a blank slate. Instead, their bureaucratic machinery, their maps, their very logic of centralized control were often taken over by the new states that emerged within their former borders. The professional, exam-based civil service in countries like India or the United Kingdom is a direct descendant of systems pioneered in Imperial China and refined by the British Raj. The standardized legal codes that govern nations across Europe and the Americas trace their lineage to the Roman corpus juris civilis. The very concept of conducting a national census to know your population for taxation and conscription is an imperial tool now used by every sovereign state. Even the borders on a contemporary map of Africa or the Middle East are frequently the legacy of lines drawn by European colonial administrators, often with a ruler on a desk, dividing ethnic and linguistic groups according to imperial convenience rather than local reality. This continuity presents a challenging reflection: how much of our current global order, with its nation-states, international law, and diplomatic protocols, is built upon these ancient imperial frameworks? The answer is a great deal. The centralized state, as the primary unit of political organization, is itself an imperial model that succeeded the patchwork of feudal lordships and tribal territories. Understanding this legacy is not about assigning blame, but about decoding the DNA of our modern world. It explains why a government office in a former French colony might still require documents in triplicate, or why the administrative capital of a country is often a port city first established for colonial trade. These are the ghostly imprints of past systems, still shaping the rhythm and structure of governance today. This inheritance forces us to look at the modern state not as a purely new invention, but as an adaptation, a reforming of old tools for new purposes. It also prompts us to look ahead, to ask what administrative innovations we are creating now that will form the legacy for future civilizations. The boardroom of a global corporation faces a dilemma a Roman governor would instantly recognize. How do you enforce a central policy from headquarters while empowering a regional office to adapt to local markets? The administrative challenges of holding a vast empire together are not relics. They are blueprints for our interconnected age. The 26th and final innovation is not a historical tool, but a living lesson. The practical wisdom these systems offer to modern global governance and multinational corporations. Our world, woven together by instant communication and supply chains spanning continents, confronts the same core puzzles of scale, diversity, and control. The empires teach us that the first principle is the balance between central vision and local execution, A company, like an empire, needs a unified brand, a consistent quality standard, and a core set of financial rules. This is the equivalent of the Roman legal code or the standardized coinage. Yet it also needs regional managers who understand local consumer habits, labor laws, and cultural nuances, much like a Persian satrap or an Ottoman millet leader. Imposing a one-size-fits-all solution from a distant headquarters can spark the corporate equivalent of a rebellion, lost market share, and low morale. The historical lesson is to build a framework strong enough to provide stability, but flexible enough to allow adaptation at the edges. Legitimizing authority is another timeless lesson. An empire could not survive on coercion alone. It had to provide something in return: security, justice, economic opportunity. Similarly, a modern organization cannot thrive if its employees or the communities it operates in see it only as an extractive force. The state granaries that fed cities and the Inca redistribution networks created a bond of dependency that was also a bond of loyalty. A corporation today might consider how its presence benefits a local community beyond the jobs it provides, perhaps through infrastructure, environmental stewardship, or cultural patronage. This turns the entity from an outsider into a stakeholder, building the social capital that sustains operations during difficult times. The risks of administrative overreach are just as relevant. The Spanish Council of the Indies, trying to micromanage a city plan in the Andes from a desk in Madrid, illustrates the friction that arises when central systems become too rigid. Bureaucracy, whether imperial or corporate, can become an end in itself, generating reports and procedures that stifle innovation and slow response to new challenges. The empires that lasted longest often had mechanisms for feedback, like the Persian eyes and ears of the king or the Chinese censors who could critique policy. Modern organizations need similar channels for frontline employees to report what is and isn't working, ensuring the system serves its purpose rather than becoming a cage. So what can a CEO or an international diplomat learn from a Mongol Khan? They learn that communication is the nervous system of any vast enterprise, that cultural intelligence is as critical as financial intelligence, and that sustainable power is often about providing more than you take. They learn that standardization enables trust, whether it is in a coin's silver content or a product safety standard. They see that investing in infrastructure, from Roman roads to digital networks, is what allows everything else to flow. Most importantly, they are reminded that no system, no matter how brilliantly designed, is permanent. The final lesson of these administrative innovations is one of humility. Each system we have explored was, in its time, the height of human ingenuity, a solution to the problem of scale. Yet each eventually met pressures it could not administer away, from shifting trade routes and new technologies to the simple, human desire for self-determination. They show us that the work of building order across distance is never finished. It is a continuous act of adaptation, negotiation, and, above all, understanding the people you are trying to connect. The silent machinery of history is still running, and we are all part of its next design. The echoes of those ancient systems still hum in the foundations of our world. From the Persian satrapies balancing local rule with central oversight to the meticulous British civil service stretching its procedures across oceans, these were not mere tools of control, but masterpieces of human organization. Each solved, in its own brilliant way, the fundamental puzzle of governing staggering complexity across impossible distances and profound cultural divides. They teach us a timeless truth that enduring power relies not just on the force that conquers, but on the systems that sustain. It is the framework of predictable law, the lifeline of rapid communication, the engine of integrated economics, and the compelling story of shared ideology that weaves conquest into lasting order. These systems created integration from chaos, turning the fragmented map of human settlement into something resembling a coherent whole. As we navigate our own hyper-connected planet, with its multinational corporations and digital networks spanning the globe, these historical blueprints are more than curiosities. They offer profound, practical insights into the art of managing large-scale human endeavors. The same tension between headquarters and regional offices, between core policy and local adaptation, played out in the courts of ancient empires. The same need to build trust through standardized systems, whether in a coin's weight or a software protocol, remains vital today. The true mystery of history is not merely what empires conquered, but how, against all odds, they managed to stay together. Their administrative genius was the quiet, relentless work of turning the idea of unity into a daily, functioning reality. Reflect on these systems for a moment. Consider their echoes in the standardized regulations of international trade, in the global supply chains you rely on, even in the very structure of the nation-states on our map. The machinery they built now powers our modern world. If you found this journey through the hidden gears of history fascinating, please subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped our civilization. And share your thoughts below. Which of these administrative innovations do you believe was the most ingenious, and where do you see its legacy living on today?